Welcome to Chapter 9. We're going to talk about improving plants and what all of that entails in this chapter. Here we go. So this is just a little bit of an outline for Chapter 9. We're going to look at 8 big topics within improving plants, especially crop plants, and how we grow them and how we breed them. So of course the first thing we're going to look at is reproduction. We'll look at a couple different scientists within that reproduction. We'll look at plant breeding, the difference between self-pollinated versus crop-pollinating plants. We'll look at genetic transformation, and then we're going to kind of compare and contrast traditional and genetic engineering, and wrap that up with how we market those plants and how they are bred to market. So here are some key concepts for this chapter. Again, these 5 are those concepts that we really try to push on you to kind of really grasp and understand. So the first one that we need to kind of go over is that chromosomes control the inheritance. So without the chromosomes within plants, we wouldn't have the different DNA that we have today. So that's really important in terms of how we breed crops. Mendelin, we'll talk about Gregor Mendelin in a little bit, but he was kind of the grandfather or the father of how this plant breeding goes, especially within the early days of plant breeding. And we'll look at how sexual reproduction of those self-pollinated and cross-pollinated plants they come into play in really every aspect of what we grow in the field, and why that's important, and why it's important to decipher what type of crops are self-pollinated and what type of crops are cross-pollinated. We're also going to look at the main steps of breeding, so everything from the collection to then giving it to the producer, because that's really the main focus on a lot of these plant breeding companies. They want to make sure that they're meeting the expectation of the producer, and how they are then growing that plant. Then we'll also look at how that genetic transformation transfers from one gene to several genes, and how that affects how we grow different plants. So crop improvement, the main thing that is important to understand with crop improvement, it's just that huge, very, very bold aspect of development of modern agriculture. So without crop improvement, we wouldn't have the yields that we have today. We wouldn't have the varieties that we have today. We wouldn't have the hybrids that we have today. So those are very important, but it all had to start somewhere, and Mendel is where all of that started, and with his principles and with the pea plants, which we'll look at in just a little bit. Those are all very, very vital to how we look at crop improvement. And had it not been for scientists like him, we wouldn't be where we are today. We wouldn't be able to grow 200 bushel corn in Oklahoma. Well, close to that. We wouldn't be able to feed this world like we are feeding it today. So that's really important. And one major fact, hint, hint, what I want you to really kind of grasp your head around is that half of the yield that we gain in this world, in the big cereal crops that we grow, is because of genetic improvement. So it's either because of a genetically modified improvement, or it's because it's a traditional breeding improvement, and we'll talk about the difference between those. So that is vital to how we look at crop improvement, and we'll look at the difference between GMOs versus non-GMOs, and how we can market that as farmers, how we can grow and sell that as farmers, which is really important. So with that, biotechnology, especially ag biotechnology, is very vital to the success of crop improvement, especially in the United States. So all that is just scientific techniques that we use to transform different plants from what they used to be to what they could be, which is kind of the way this progressive movement in science is going. I love this graph in your book, and so I wanted to talk to you about it. So this is where we're looking at soybeans, wheat, and corn. So corn is the green, soybeans is that reddish color, and then wheat is the wheat, or the blue color, excuse me. So if you're looking at back in the 1900s, so 1900 to 1904, you can see those yields in corn and in wheat, and how they were extremely low. So when we start to look at the latter part of the 20th century, we can see how they have just skyrocketed. How is that? Because we've improved how we've grown that product, and that could be traditional breeding, that could be GMOs, that could be a lot of different things. But I think, you know, GMOs kind of get the backlash of that because we have seen such a significant increase in bushels per acre every single year. And of course, you know, we're going to have those down years, but that's due to different things like climate, you know, the weather at that time, if we had too much rain, if we had too less of rain, if we were in a drought. The economy has a big play in it. And this week we will definitely look at prices, so get ready. Because that's an important aspect of that, because we might be able to grow enough bushels, but are we going to be able to meet that break-even point as well? So just a pretty cool graph to show you. So this is going to show you, you know, corn-wise, we're almost hitting 200, and in some places in this country we are hitting way over 200. But you can see that soybeans and wheat, they're still hanging out in 2008 around 40 to 50 bushels. But now in 2018 we are seeing it a lot more. So we're seeing the 60 to 80 bushel range in both of those, which is awesome, and it's great. But are the prices reflecting what that farmer is growing? That's the question that we have to answer. So reproduction in plants and how that's important. So main thing that is really important to understand is that all occurs within the seed. So that reproduction is going to either it's a sexual reproduction that happens, and it's either going to be a self or a cross-pollinated. And in some cases, this is actually more common nowadays, but it can actually be a mix of self and cross-pollinated, and we'll talk about the difference between those. So how does that mode of reproduction happen? Well, it all is determined by the crop and how that breeding happens within the crop, which is really important to understand. So again, if you're a little confused on the self versus cross, that self-pollination just occurs when that pollen is transferred from the stigma of that plant to the flower, okay, in the same flower. And then the cross-pollination is that pollen that is fertilized through the oval that's located within another plant. Okay, so two different ways of reproducing, but they're both sexually reproducing plants that are either self or cross-pollinated, or then in a mix. So now let's look at DNA, chromosomes, and genes. Very, very vital to how we look at this in terms of breeding, because if we don't know those three main aspects of or components of that plant cell, we're not going to be able to breed it the way we want to breed it. So the cell wall, cytoplasm, and the nucleus are those three main really, really important components that we look at in terms of breeding. Now, all of the plant cell parts are very important, like we've learned in the last couple chapters, but those three are extremely vital to the way we breed plants. Make sure you know that. Hint, hint. So the cytoplasm, it's going to contain a lot of those organelles and those very important specific functions of the plant, so what that plant's really big job is. And then obviously the chromosomes is where that inheritance is controlled, and then the DNA obviously from the genes. So it's going to be able to determine the metabolic activity of those cells. That's really important in how we're growing yields, and so that's then going to dictate the amino acids and how that protein is then synthesized in that plant or in that breeding of plants. So chromosomes by number and meiosis. Okay, so I'm sure you remember from your probably 5th grade, maybe 6th grade science class, meiosis versus mitosis. Okay, so meiosis is just another type of process that is really critical to growth, and it's a cell division that then reduces the genetic content by half. Okay, so when you think meiosis, think that cell division that's being reduced, that genetic content by half. Okay, And it's very important with sexual reproduction from the male and the female reproduction organs. Okay, so that's meiosis. Mitosis is really important because we have to look at all different type of aspects with mitosis and how we then interject those critical growth and development, the critical growth and development inserts within the cells. Okay, so this is the process of meiosis. So you have those pair of chromosomes, the diploid. Okay, so if in your reading you've read about the 2N. Okay, so when that diploid is then we're going through that meiosis 1 and then 2, those chromosomes then replicate. Then it's divided between a parent cell into 2, and then those cells then divide. Okay, giving you those haploid gamete cells. Okay, so the 1N. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you should have read your book. Chapter 9.